Hi again. Welcome to part two of my lecture on symbiosis. In this section, we'll define exactly what we mean by symbiosis and also talk about one part of the spectrum of symbiosis, parasitism. So, symbiosis is defined as any type of close physical, long term biological interaction between two species. And typically, symbiosis is thought to occur along a continuum or a spectrum from mutualism, which is an interaction in which both species benefit, all the way down to parasitism, which is defined as an interaction in which one species benefits and the other is harmed, sometimes resulting in death. Uh, and in between, we have commensalism, which is an interaction in which one organism benefits and the other is unaffected. And we imagine that these symbiotic relationships can occur anywhere along this continuum or this spectrum. And studies of these sorts of symbiotic interactions suggest that in many instances, mutualisms have evolved from what was once a parasitic interaction. Now, one thing to point out is that if you read the literature, oftentimes people refer to symbiosis as only including a mutualistic interaction or a mutualistic relationship, and that's not true. Okay, so a parasitic interaction is as much a symbiosis as is a mutualistic interaction. Another thing to point out about these symbiotic interactions is that they can be facultative, in which the fitness of one partner in the relationship is not absolutely dependent on the presence of the other partner. And for example, a parasite might be able to use more than one host species, or mutualists can continue to persist in the absence of one another. For example, aphids and ants are often involved in mutualistic interactions, and they certainly can live independent of one another. In contrast to facultative symbiosis, we have obligate symbioses, and they occur when the fitness of one partner in the relationship requires the presence of the other partner. And obligate symbioses are evolutionarily the result of ecological specialization. In mutualistic symbiotic relationships, there can be an asymmetry between the partners in which only one partner is obligately dependent on the other. And a good example of that is the endosymbiont blockmonia, which occurs in carpenter ants. And carpenter ants are able to survive and do okay in the absence of blockmonia, but blockmonia does not occur outside the gut of carpenter ants. So one classic example of symbiotic relationship that we've already talked about is the endosymbiotic theory for the origin of eukaryotes, in which a primordial eukaryotic organism engulfed a bacteria, a protobacteria, which became the mitochondria, and another plant progenitor engulfed a photosynthetic prokaryote, which became chloroplasts. Okay, and chloroplasts and mitochondria are now organelles within eukaryotic cells, and they are now we know clearly that they originally came from free living microorganisms. So some some symbiotic organisms can be both a parasite and a mutualist, and that is they span the continuum from parasite to mutualist. And a good example of that is the bacteria Wolbachia, which is found in lots of insects and arthropods. It is found in the same group of organisms that are thought to have given rise to the mitochondria, and it is widespread in insects and invertebrates, and it is transmitted maternally. So as a parasite, in some host species, the males die during larval development, which increases the rate of infected females. In other hosts, infected males develop as females or sterile pseudo-females. And still in other hosts, the males are eliminated entirely and females reproduce parthenogenically. In lots of other species, infected males can only successfully mate with infected females. So in this case, Wolbachia is acting as a parasite that has a negative impact on the males of their host. It also can act as a mutualist in other species. For example, Drosophila that are infected with Wolbachia are resistant to some RNA viruses. And higher levels of Wolbachia are correlated with insecticide resistance in the house mosquito, Culex pippins, and in filarial nematode worms that cause such nasty diseases as elephantiasis. Wolbachia is an obligate endosymbiont that's required for survival and reproduction. And disease ecologists are actually looking at the elimination of Wolbachia from these nematode worms as a way to prevent or cure diseases such as elephantiasis. So let's talk more about parasitism. So parasitism is a symbiotic relationship between two species that benefit the fitness of the parasite and harms the fitness of the host. Parasites can live on or in the host and typically need only one host individual to survive and reproduce. This is in contrast to a predator, which needs many prey individuals in order to survive and reproduce. Ectoparasites live outside the body of a host. A good example of that are lice that are found on birds. Endoparasites live inside the body of the host, and a good example of that is the malarial causing plasmodium, which we'll talk about in more detail in just a few minutes. Parasites are usually transmitted horizontally among hosts, either directly or through a vector, like a mosquito. Okay, so clicker question. Name a parasite that is transmitted vertically to hosts. So we just said that parasites are normally transmitted horizontally, but I gave you an example of one that's transmitted vertically. What is it? I'll give you a sec. Okay, it's the Wolbachia that we talked about just two slides ago. Okay, so this is an unusual parasite, and that's maybe why it can function both as a parasite and a mutualist, because it does tend to be transmitted vertically. So here's an example of an evolutionary arms race between a parasite and its host. And this is the parasite that causes malaria in humans. So as many of you probably know, malaria is transmitted to humans through a vector, which is a mosquito. And there are several mosquitoes that are involved. There are several different plasmodiums that are involved in giving rise to malaria. But one of the interesting things is that the plasmodium, when it's in the mosquito, it manipulates the behavior of this mosquito so that the mosquito is more likely to take a blood meal when the plasmodium is ready to be transmitted to its human host. So it's less likely to bite when the mosquito is first infected, and the mosquito is more likely to bite after the parasite matures in the body of the mosquito. And the plasmodium, once it is infects a human, it ends up in the red blood cells, and the parasite modifies the surface of the red blood cells to make them stick to the outside of blood vessels and avoid the host immune system that's in the spleen. So if they were to go through the spleen, they may the blood cells that are infected were to go through the spleen may have removed them and the parasite as well. And sickle cell anemia protects individuals from the effect of malaria because apparently it disrupts the parasite's ability to make the red blood cells sticky by changing their shape. And so sickle cell anemia, we've talked about that earlier, is a genetic disease in humans, and it occurs most frequently in areas where malaria is endemic. And it provides a defense against malaria for individuals that are heterozygous for that gene, for the reasons that we said in the previous slide. But individuals that are homozygous for that gene suffer from a bad anemia, and therefore there is a high cost that the host pays to defend itself against malaria through sickle cell anemia. And as you can imagine, if individuals that have the sickle cell gene occur outside of the area of malaria, they can be at a serious fitness disadvantage. And it's not surprising that this particular gene is selected negatively in other areas of the world. So another example of a coevolutionary arms race between parasites and hosts involves parasitoid wasps and their insect hosts. So, for example, there are small wasps in the family Braconidae that attack aphids, and they lay their egg in the aphid. The egg hatches, and the larva ends up causing the aphid to become mummified. The larva consumes the body of the aphid and then emerges as adults. And the aphids have evolved a mutualism with a bacterial endosymbiont, Haemotonella defensa, that harbors a virus, APSE, that breaks open the bacteria cells and releases a toxin that can kill the developing wasps. So in this particular case, this endosymbiont is acting as a defense against parasitism by the wasps. In another example, again involving Braconidae wasps that attack Lepidopteran caterpillars, the caterpillars defend themselves by encapsulating the egg or larvae of the wasps after they've been oviposited in. They use special cells called hematocytes that seek out the egg or the larva and wrap themselves around it and essentially suffocate the wasp egg or the wasp larva in the body of the caterpillar. And the wasps have evolved a mutualism with a special group of polydnaviruses that prevents the host encapsulation response. And so when the wasp injects its egg into the body of the caterpillar, it also injects these polydnaviruses into the body of the caterpillar, which prevents the encapsulation response. So again, there is a defense by the host against attack by the parasite or parasitoid, and then the parasitoid can evolve a counter defense against the defense of the host. And this can go back and forth in evolutionary time repeatedly. Now, one thing that's interesting about these polydnaviruses is that there are parasitoids that attack the developing parasitoid in the body of the caterpillar. These are called hyperparasitoids. And some of these hyperparasitoids apparently are cueing in on the presence of polydnavirus, because that tells the hyperparasitoid that that caterpillar has been parasitized. Okay, so let's wrap up this part of our lecture. I have 3 questions to ask you to test your understanding. So here are 3 true-false questions. So stop the video here and see if you can answer these questions, and then restart the video after you've answered the questions and see which ones you've got right and which ones you got wrong. Okay, I'll give you a sec. Okay, welcome back. Let's go through these true-false questions. So the first one is, symbiosis occurs when 2 species have a mutually beneficial interaction with one another. That's false, because symbioses also include parasitism and commensalism. A second question, sickle cell anemia in humans is an evolved defense against malaria and therefore always adaptive. This is also false. Sickle cell anemia is only adaptive in areas with malaria and still comes with a high cost in the homozygous state. It's selected against in areas without malaria. And the last question is, polydnaviruses in parasitoid wasps help prevent encapsulation response in host caterpillars. That's true. Polydnaviruses are mutualists of the parasitoid, and they prevent their eggs, the parasitoid's eggs, from a host encapsulation response. Okay, this concludes part 2 of my lecture on symbiosis. So let's move on to part 3.